I'll never forget that night on the road. I've been a truck driver for over 10 years, and I've seen my share of weird things. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what happened on that empty stretch of highway last October. I was hauling a load of supplies across the country, heading down Route 23. It was late, and I was tired. The only light on the road was my headlights cutting through the darkness. It was one of those nights where the sky seemed darker than usual, no moon, no stars. Just a thick, eerie fog hanging low to the ground. I'd heard rumors about Route 23 ghost stories mostly, about truckers seeing strange things, but I'd never been one to believe in that kind of stuff. I just wanted to get my load delivered and find a place to rest. Around midnight, I started to feel like something was off. I couldn't explain it, but I got this strange feeling, like I wasn't alone. I glanced in my mirrors, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Just darkness behind me. I shook it off, blamed it on fatigue, and turned up the radio a bit to keep myself awake. After a while, I saw something in the distance. It looked like a person, standing on the side of the road, half hidden in the fog. My first thought was that it was a hitchhiker. I was tempted to keep going. It's against company policy to pick up strangers, but something about this person looked desperate. They were waving their arms, trying to get my attention. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman. She looked pale, with long, tangled hair, wearing an old-fashioned dress that seemed out of place. I rolled down my window just a bit. "Are you okay?" I called out, keeping my foot on the brake. She didn't answer at first, just stared at me with these hollow, dark eyes. Finally, she whispered, "Can you take me home?" Her voice was soft, almost too soft to hear over the engine. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in. Her clothes were damp, like she'd been standing in the fog for a long time. We started driving, and I tried to make small talk, asking where she was from and where she needed to go. But she didn't say much, just kept staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. I noticed her hands were ice cold and slightly trembling. About 10 minutes down the road, I started to get this sick feeling in my stomach. Something about her just felt wrong. She wasn't blinking, wasn't moving at all. I decided to ask her again, "Where exactly do you need to go?" This time she turned to me slowly, her face blank, her eyes staring right through me. "Home," she whispered, and pointed straight ahead. But there was nothing there, just more road disappearing into the darkness. Suddenly, the truck's radio started crackling with static. The signal was dead, but I could hear faint voices, almost like someone was trying to speak through the static. I couldn't make out any words, just an eerie, whispering sound that sent chills down my spine. I looked over at her, but she was staring straight ahead again, like she hadn't even noticed. Then, out of nowhere, she started humming. It was a soft, haunting tune, something that sounded old, like a lullaby. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what to do, so I just kept driving, hoping we'd reach some sort of town soon. Finally, after what felt like hours, she pointed to a small dirt road off to the side. "Turn here," she whispered. The road wasn't on my GPS, but I turned anyway, hoping to get this strange passenger where she needed to go so I could leave. The dirt road was rough and barely wide enough for my truck, with trees pressing in on both sides. My headlights barely lit the way, and the fog seemed thicker than ever. I kept driving, my grip tight on the steering wheel, until we came to an old, abandoned house at the end of the road. It was dark, the windows broken, with vines creeping up the walls. "This is home," she said, and for the first time she smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, empty, and it chilled me to the bone. She opened the door and stepped out without another word. I watched her walk toward the house, her figure disappearing into the fog. I sat there, feeling like I was in some kind of trance, until a sudden noise snapped me out of it. The radio crackled again, and this time I heard a clear voice, my dispatcher. "Tom, where are you?" "You're off route." I grabbed the radio, trying to explain, but then I looked up, and she was gone. The house was gone. I was sitting on an empty stretch of dirt road with nothing but trees around me. My heart was pounding, and I felt sick. I didn't understand. I had just dropped her off, right there, at that house. I turned my truck around and sped back to the main road, not looking back once. When I finally got to a gas station, I asked the clerk if he knew anything about an old house on that road. He looked at me, his face pale, and said, "There was an old house down that road, but it burned down years ago, along with the family that lived there. They say sometimes the mother tries to hitch rides, looking for someone to take her home." I didn't finish my route that night. I pulled over at the next truck stop, locked my doors, and sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to be made. I'll never know who or what I picked up that night. But every time I drive down Route 23 now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear that haunting lullaby in the distance. As I sat in my truck, the weight of what had happened pressed on me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't shake the image of her face, those hollow eyes, that empty smile. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, maybe even a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road. But I knew deep down that it was real. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face staring back at me, her mouth forming silent words. Eventually, I gave up on sleep and decided to just drive, to put as much distance between myself and that stretch of Route 23 as possible. The fog had started to lift, and the stars were beginning to peek through, but I still felt like I was being watched. I'd been driving for about an hour when I noticed something strange in my side mirror. There was a dark figure standing by the road far behind me. At first I thought it was a shadow, maybe just a trick of the light. But as I kept glancing back, it seemed to be moving, following me at a distance. My heart pounded harder with each glance. Then, the figure was gone. I shook my head, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, I told myself. But the road ahead didn't feel any safer. The air in the truck felt colder, heavier, like I was dragging something with me. After a few more miles, I spotted a diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. I pulled in, hoping a cup of coffee and a few people around me might shake off the feeling that I was being followed. The place was nearly empty, just a tired-looking waitress and an old man sitting at the counter, sipping coffee. I took a seat at a corner booth, away from the windows, and ordered a strong coffee. The waitress brought it over, eyeing me with a mix of curiosity and pity. "Rough night?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, trying to decide if I should tell her. "I picked up a hitchhiker back on Route 23, I said finally, keeping my voice low. She asked me to take her home, but there was no house, just fog, and when I got to the spot, she vanished." The waitress froze for a moment, her eyes widening just slightly before she composed herself. She exchanged a quick look with the old man at the counter, who had stopped mid-sip, his eyes locked on me. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "Did she have long, dark hair?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Wearing a dress, old-fashioned." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yes, that's her." The old man put his coffee down, his hands shaking. "I saw her once too, years ago. Picked her up right around the same spot. She asked for a ride and I gave it to her. But when I got to the end of the road, she was gone." He took a deep breath, his eyes distant, as if he were reliving a nightmare. "They say she's been there for decades, looking for someone to take her home. Her family died in a fire, and she never left. Some say she's waiting for someone to join her." The waitress crossed herself and muttered something under her breath. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Here was a man who knew exactly what I'd been through, who had seen her too. It wasn't just a legend or some old ghost story. It was real. As I sat there trying to process everything, the lights in the diner flickered. I glanced at the window, and for a split second, I saw her reflection. She was standing outside, looking right at me, her eyes hollow, her face expressionless. I jumped out of my seat, nearly spilling my coffee. But when I looked again, she was gone. The waitress and the old man were staring at me, their faces pale. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I'd seen. I paid for my coffee, left a tip, and hurried back to my truck, my heart racing. I started the engine and pulled out of the diner's lot, determined to put as much distance between me and that ghost as I could. But as I drove down the road, the radio crackled to life again, filled with static. Through the noise, I heard the faintest sound, a woman's voice, humming that same haunting lullaby. I turned the radio off, but the humming continued, growing louder, filling the cab of the truck. I knew I was alone, but it felt like she was right there beside me. Then I looked in the passenger seat, and my heart stopped. There on the seat was a single, charred piece of fabric. It was the same color as the dress she'd been wearing. I don't know how it got there. I don't know what it means. But I know this: I'll never take Route 23 again. And every time I get in my truck, I feel like I'm not alone. That somehow she's still with me, waiting for the day when I'll take her all the way home. Since that night, every long drive feels different. The road doesn't hold the same comfort it once did. Instead, each mile I cover feels like a step deeper into something I can't escape. Some nights, when the highway is empty and the silence too thick, I hear faint humming in the distance. It drifts through the static on the radio, soft and haunting, as if she's calling out to me from somewhere beyond. I try to ignore it, tell myself it's all in my head, but there are times I catch a glimpse in the rearview mirror, a shadow sitting silently in the back seat, waiting. And each time my grip tightens on the wheel, my heart pounding as I realize that no matter how far I drive, some part of her is still with me, forever bound to that lonely, haunted road.